Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura Hanson with Connect My Brain. I am so glad that you are tuning in. It is a rainy morning here in Atlanta, Georgia, but the sun has peeked through all those clouds. So the light is on and we are ready to go. We are working on the marvelous world of reflexes. You know, just going over this in preparation to talk to you, I am just so reminded of how fascinating the primitive reflexes are. And I can remember how this came into my understanding years ago. I was teaching a course at Palmer Chiropractic College in Florida called Rehabilitation of the Spine. And chapter 7, I completely remember this. And it was going over all the posture and all the known postural adaptations of the human body. And it was talking about postural reflexes, which the way I like to phrase it is the third tier. So we have the withdrawal reflexes, the beginning of our defense system for survival. We have the primitive reflexes because that means they start in the womb and finish after the baby is born. And then we have the postural reflexes, which actually begin the first moments of life as that baby begins to lift its own head in gravity. So it's a marvelous system, and it really helps us identify foundational pieces of how this incredible nervous system got wired up. And then I always like people to understand that this precedes sensory motor. So when we look and talk about kids, and I get a lot of children that come through that are labeled to have some kind of sensory motor deficit. Well, it just can't start there because there's a whole other system that precedes how sensory motor comes online. And that's what went off like a light bulb when I was teaching that course, when I was looking at the postural reflexes and knowing that we've already figured out all these incredible adaptations, but what comes before that? And it's the world of reflexes, the withdrawal, the primitive, before the postural, but the postural too as an infant, as a newborn. And then they actually are emerging while that little one is learning how to navigate itself in gravity. And this is why we look at things when we're looking at children. We look at their posture. We look at their balance. We look at how they interact in the world. We watch, do they go towards things like riding a bicycle, or does that scare them? Even some subtle movements sometimes really alter a child's emotional stability, which then just kind of keeps throwing off the system because it's stressed out all the time. So today, as we move along our little list of reflexes, I'm going to talk about rooting. And if time permits, I'll go into spinal galant. But I was really fascinated preparing myself with today's show and being reminded of so many of these key elements for this particular reflex called rooting. Now, rooting actually, it's primitive, so that means it begins in the womb. And it literally begins around 24 to 28 weeks of pregnancy. It is completely present at birth, and it's meant to inhibit around 3 to 4 months postnatal life. What it is literally generating is the innate searching from that newborn, searching its environment. I remember one time I saw a beautiful video of after the baby was born and laid on the mother's left breast, and that is intentional, how they literally filmed how that baby was already searching its environment. And it's because that this particular reflex is very, very strong the first couple of hours after birth. And if it is not gratified by finding the breast, then it actually weakens the reflex. So the reflex comes in and out, in and out. So it has this innate search. It creates sucking and also swallowing, but link those together for feeding. So it has this innate response to search, but it doesn't have the visual capability yet to actually see and find. So when we talk about rooting, it literally is a reflex that creates other reflexes. So let's really think about this word searching for just a minute. Remember, I was telling you that sensory motor is going to come after these reflexes. And I don't want to make it sound like a finite timeline, meaning that sensory motor will come in exactly at 3 to 4 months. It's about laying down connections. Remember they asked you, or perhaps you're pregnant and you're listening to this, but remember they always asked you, was the baby moving? So we're going to talk about how reflexes are all going on at the same time. So the rooting, when you actually think about the mechanism of rooting, it is a very light touch on the cheek. And that is literally what is going to stimulate the baby to turn towards the stimulus and then open its mouth. So for the podcast audience, I'm literally just taking my fingers and brushing my cheek from the corner of my mouth outward. And this is the direct neurological part that is going to generate the actual response that we physically see, the mechanical part that we see going on. But there's so much more. So there's also the sucking. So initially we are guiding the baby towards the breast or the bottle, or we're placing the breast or bottle right at the baby's mouth. And that is where the latch is going to occur. But it's also going to create a conditioned reflex that with this stimulus and the searching and the sucking, I am going to get fed. And so it comes in those cycles of needing to be fed. So especially early on, right after birth, we're trying to get that relationship truly anchored. And in the beginning, mom is going to feel like a human pacifier, because in the beginning, some of this is not always about feeding, because lots of times moms will tell you, I just feel like my baby's hungry all the time. Now we're talking about newborns. And I feel like my baby's at the breast all the time. Well, what's really going on is your baby is laying down the supply and demand for the full length of your time for breastfeeding. So the stimulus is there not only for the baby, but the sucking part is literally creating the reflex inside of mom for her to generate her milk supply, just like the birth process. And we're going to talk a little bit deeper about the dance of the birth process when we talk about spinal gallant. But it is still that type of dynamic relationship. Baby and mommy are so intimately connected that baby is helping mom set up her own body to be able to take care of the baby for the length of time that breastfeeding typically goes on. And we can get into breastfeeding and how long should you breastfeed. I don't think there should be these strict rules. I think it really is a very individual thing. I think if a mom could breastfeed for about a year, that is golden, because there's just so much going on in that first year, and the connection that it creates between mom and baby, and that fulfillment for that baby is so important. But there are people that breastfeed for years. So I think that's a very personal decision. I think there's a lot of things that go on in our life that have to be considered when we're making these kinds of decisions, right? So let's leave that part for another discussion. But there is this beautiful intimacy that goes on. Now, yes, there are many situations. I never want anybody to ever walk away from one of the podcasts feeling like if they couldn't do something that was a terrible thing, because there's so many different situations that go on in our life that can prevent us from doing things. So even if you're in that situation, which my heart is always extended, you can still make that intimacy and the connection with your baby, even with a bottle. Some women can pump and put it into a bottle. Some women can get a breast milk donor. If none of those options are available, we definitely want to help you with creating formula rather than going to commercial. If commercial is your only option, then we want to help you find the cleanest grade of formula and also very clean sources of water. Do not heat that water up in a plastic bottle in a microwave. Try to avoid a microwave because it really does change things. Just use a tea kettle and heat up that water. But there's so many different ways of doing things. And, that's the heart of me and doing this is my love of teaching. I have been teaching since I think about 2004. And I used to travel quite a bit and speak sometimes about 32 weeks a year on the weekends. And I truly love it. I've been given the gift of gab, I believe, and I have a way of bringing things down to a very simple point. And sometimes I just think that transparency is so vital to help people understand options, choices, and then to also feel connected. It has a lot to do with the name of the practice, Connect My Brain. It's not just about connecting your brain. The tagline is to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's about connecting with people. And when people really have the opportunity to hear these podcasts and maybe watch the video over at YouTube at Dr. Laura Hanson's channel, I hope you see that passion in my heart that I'm here to serve, but I also feel like I've been given a very unique way of delivery, and what I'm trying to do is to help people on many different levels. So we can always talk about, the ideal situation, but wow, especially the last 3 years of life, I think those ideals have just been truly thrown out the window. I also feel very passionate that there's a time crunch. Especially with the last 3 years, there's so much research that's coming out about our children and how this has impacted them. And I even hear that in my office where there's children that have lost their drive to engage in like extracurricular activities because everything kind of turned into a Zoom meeting. And we've got to get our kids moving again. We've got to get our kids connected again. We've got to get our kids out there and not to be afraid. These have such far-reaching impacts on their individual lives and their optimal development. So that's always where the backbone of this podcast, the practice, me, this is where we're coming from is I do believe that God has truly just downloaded so much information and there's a time period to get it out. So I want you to know that if you can't do everything just by the book, that's okay. If you need help, reach out. Send a lead request in through the website at connectmybrain.com. Tell me when you're available. Tell me what's going on. And if I don't know the answer, I'll help you get connected. If you're somewhere far and you need that connection, I'll try to help you find it. I'll give you either ideas of ways to find it, or I may in fact know someone. But if you're having trouble with feeding your baby, this is a big deal because this one has such a far-reaching effect. Little preemie babies, there's part of this reflex that wouldn't even have finished its primal maturation. And when I use the word primal, I'm referring to the development in the womb and being in mom's womb. So sometimes little preemies, when they come out, we've got to work on eliciting the stimulation. But one of the things that happens from what I've described of the mechanical part, you may think all you got to do is brush the cheek, but that's not necessarily true. There's so many other things that have been preceding this part of development. This isn't happening until, about 3/4 of the way through pregnancy. So all those other things, the withdrawal reflexes, Moro, Palmar, they've already been going on. Let's tie Palmar back into this reflex of rooting. And if you haven't listened to that particular podcast, go back and listen to it after you hear this, because what we described was the neurological loop between the hands and the mouth and even the feet. So that when we put this pressure, so I'm taking my thumb and I'm pushing it into my hand, that baby's hand will close. That's palmar. But what you also see is what we call kneading, Kneading, of the fingers, as well as oral or mouth movements. All of this is in preparation with rooting of the stimulus moving towards and eventually searching and eventually creating that conditioned response of seeing the stimulus of the breast or the bottle and then placing the hand to hold it. Wow. This is so innate. This was just so divinely designed because feeding represents survival. The searching will eventually move more towards that sensory motor. Sensory is seeking. searching your environment, getting those stimuluses. Why babies, when they're moving around with crawling on their bellies and putting things in their hands and putting them in their mouths, because they're searching their environment, which is going to create that sensory motor responses. Wow. It's just amazing to me how these little reflexes are so far reaching. It also involves the actual mechanical movement of swallowing. So some babies coming into this world early may not have that tone in the mouth yet to do all these things, because this particular reflex, in combination with all the things that preceded it, hasn't finished what it's supposed to do. Now, I wish I could just tell you, do this, and everything's going to move like a set of dominoes. One, it's not clinically responsible to sit here and tell people, just do this and your baby will be fine. So this is why I'm always encouraging you to reach out. I not only have the practice in Atlanta, Georgia, but we work remotely. If you go over to the website, connectmybrain.com, there is an e-school. And in the e-school, there is a pediatric remote assessment. And if I can work with you in certain parts of development, I absolutely will do that. We also took part of our program called the Fantastic Seven, which is a foundational piece for core development that is on the website through the eSchool. So this is what I'm trying to always relay, is that we have resources, we are open to conversation, and understanding development is absolutely essential for you, and for you to understand your child and for your child to move in that right direction. Okay, so we've talked about that light touch is also connected to the withdrawal reflexes. So we could also have an issue with the withdrawal reflexes that's impeding, rooting, and maybe even disrupting its cycle, maybe even disrupting its completing its job and becoming inhibited around 3 to 4 months. And that's what we're always looking at when we're talking about these reflexes, because they come in while you're in the womb, they do a job, and then they're supposed to inhibit. Now, that word inhibit does not mean that they go away. It means that they are inhibited. Therefore, if ever something happens, even as an adult, you have these communication circuits that will come back online, because they are the rudimentary place of all learning, and they are going to help in those rehab situations, especially with things like strokes or maybe a brain injury, because these reflexes absolutely do come back. So keep that in mind as we're talking about what else these reflexes are doing. It's not just about eating. It's not just about searching and sucking, which sucking is so important for a baby to learn how to do. I am a person that believes in a baby using a pacifier, and I'll tell you why. There's probably people out there going, oh, I can't believe she's saying that. But I do, because sucking is a reflex, and it is the way the baby self-soothes, learns how that initial part. So we can't keep a child at a breast or bottle 24/7, but that baby could learn how to soothe, regulate, adapt to its environment better. Adaptation is one of the key components when you are looking at the development of a child. We have fine motor, gross motor, social, communication, and adaptation. In many of the podcasts, I've talked about that word adaptation. And adaptation is, am I adapting to my environment? In fact, when we work with people, we actually do a stress response test with them. One of the components that we are literally testing in that stress response is adaptation. A person's coming into a new environment. We got them all hooked up with wires. How do you handle something new? How do you handle a transition, a change, something that is giving all kinds of different sensory stimulus? So it's a great way for that child to learn to regulate itself in their environment. Now, I absolutely do not think you should continue with pacifiers, into toddler years, because as the teeth are developing, it can shift things, but so can an uninhibited rooting reflex. So a child that did not develop searching, sucking, swallowing, they can get a very high arch, which then is going to change the whole structure of the mouth and require orthodontics down the road. So what we're trying to do is balance it out. I think around a year again is a good time. Here's the caveat. If a child is developing as they should, the child should put it down for themselves. I would call that a red flag on either extreme. If the child can't put this thing down after a year, there is probably some emotional dysregulation going on, and they're continuing to soothe themselves. There's even a couple of other ones. A cranial misalignment will cause a child to have a continued need to suck because it's literally massaging the cranial vault. Headbangers have a cranial misalignment. If your child is doing this, find a chiropractor that works with children that does cranial work. If you're in the Atlanta area, reach out. I do that type of work, which makes a huge difference in the baby. And in fact, when you're working with babies, that's the principal adjustment that I really work on, because it is the first part of real bony movement that goes on. And again, I'll highlight a lot of the pieces of what goes on in the birth process when we get to that next reflex, which will probably be next time, because there's still some pieces that I want to highlight with you regarding this reflex, because it is so far reaching. I wrote down rooting can be at root of a frustrated baby. So remember I said that this reflex is at its strongest right after that baby is born. If it doesn't get satisfied, it causes frustration. And of course, how can that little one tell you that, right? And what rooting does is it moves in a cycle. So some people, I hear all kinds of things from parents when, especially new parents. And I was a new parent once, and believe me, there were so many things I wish I had done differently. So this is coming from a place of wisdom and not judgment. So one thing about a pacifier, parents will say, well, my baby doesn't like a pacifier. It always spits it out. Okay, let's break that one down. First of all, the baby is in a reflex system, which it means it's automatic. If that baby cannot get the tongue to the roof of the mouth, it cannot latch well, it cannot feed with its bottle well, and it may even have what I call a heavy tongue. And that means that that tongue is literally forward more than it should be. And therefore, when you go and try to put a pacifier in that baby's mouth, it can't retract the tongue and pull it up to the roof of the mouth and begin to suck. So it's not that the baby doesn't like it. That's a red flag for you to say, maybe something is going on and maybe I should get this checked out. This is about developmental care and learning what those red flags look like. The second thing is how this is related to that frustration. And what about colic? So colic is typically this vagal situation, your vagus nerve, which runs from your brainstem all the way down your spine. It's coupled with the nerves, the cranial nerves that go to the mouth and go to the shoulders. And it literally then, and it's inside of the cranium. It's in an area of the cranium called the occiput, which at birth is in 4 pieces. And those little nerves are actually in between the lateral and the medial piece of that bone. And for my podcast audience, I've got my fingers up representing the occiput in the back of the skull. This between my second and third finger would be the brain stem, and then over to the right and to the left, 2 pieces. So the far piece and then the piece closest to the brainstem, right in between there are 3 cranial nerves, the vagus nerve and then the cranial nerves that go to the shoulders and to the mouth. So many times, if that baby is born by C-section, that cranial plate did not finish its work. If there was some type of instrumentation used, that cranial plate could be stuck in the wrong position. And lots of times this is related to colic. It's related to poor feeding and getting a cranial adjustment, getting the cranial system worked on, allowing those bones, because they are incredibly malleable. Think about the fontanelles. You know, those are the baby's soft spots. And that means that there's still a lot of growth to go on. So those cranial plates move. So, and they also have a very viable job of pumping cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain and the spinal cord. So, I mean, again, this is just so far reaching, right? The ATNR is also involved in the rooting. We talked about ATNR last time. ATNR is where you turn your head and your arm and leg reflexively go out to that side. So in rooting, if I'm stimulating the cheek, if that reflex isn't working right, excuse me, in rooting, if that reflex isn't working right, it's going to be very difficult for the baby to turn its head. Wonder if this has anything to do with torticollis. So babies can get stuck in the womb. And if they're not, remember I told you ATNR is the kick. So if that baby isn't turning its head properly in the womb, could lead to torticollis as well. You know, I guess I just cannot emphasize enough how far reaching these little reflexes go and how development is one layer upon another layer, upon another layer, upon another layer. And that is why it is not a cookbook. That is why it is not one size fits all, one program for everybody. You have to look at the whole background, the blueprint of how this life came to be, so that you can truly understand where do you need to go in, release, activate, inhibit. It could be many different things that have to go on in order to push the dominoes forward, to get development to go in the direction that you want it to go in. To ultimately get into the correct position and actually see the breast or bottle. We move from this reflex of just the searching, getting ready to suck and swallow, to a conditioned reflex to see it, to then go and hold it. This is creating what eventually will begin to be those postural reflexes of head writing. Where is your head in space? Which will lead to balance, proprioception, and eventually sensory motor. A retained rooting reflex creates enormous sensitivities and an immature response to touch around the mouth. A retained rooting will impede a baby from eating solid foods. The suck reflex would automatically prevent the tongue from developing to that mature combination of movement to chew and to swallow. Because of the Babkin response, it will impede how the hands will work, which will impede the inhibition of palmar, how the child will learn to either write with a pincer grip or a full fist. It will impede speech. It will keep retained oral reflexes. The tongue will be impeded and forward. All of this would be incredibly complicated by tongue tie, which we will definitely do a podcast on. It will interfere with the lack of maturity for swallowing, which may cause an increase in the arch of the palate and the need for orthodontics later in life. One little reflex, rooting, can have such a far-reaching effect. Thanks so much for listening today. If you have any questions, you got to reach out. Feel free to reach out to connectmybrain.com. Send me your questions. Send me when are you available so that we can quickly make an appointment and get on the phone and chat with one another. We are here with resources and answers. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go check out the website. Go over to the podcast for show notes and Dr. Hansen's developmental milestone download. Check us out on YouTube. We have 2 channels, Connect My Brain and Dr. Laura Hansen. Connect My Brain is early work, and Dr. Laura Hansen has come together since the onset of the podcast, thanks to my podcast manager, Marcy Page. Just do great work together. Thanks for tuning in. Be blessed.